Yeah, as Jim was talking about season planning, it seemed appropriate that, like, maybe when we get the question, we'll talk about the actual, like, workouts in general. And there are a couple of things that I think go into this. You can go pretty much to any clinic here. And, you know, whether it's Todd DeSorbo or John Urbanchek or, you know, whatever year you're dealing with, that someone has been successful and they say, okay, this is how we train. And then everybody copies it. And then there's massive amounts of, I know, at the end of the year. Because a lot of the stuff is individual. So I think in terms of that, it's good to look at just conceptually how to think about some of this. Number one, you know, in terms of like, you can decide how long you want to spend on, you know, developing, because everybody's got different seasons. I mean, you know, when I was coaching high school, we had, you know, we started like November and we ended in February. So if we're going to spend, you know, 3 months developing aerobic capacity, you know, we weren't getting very far at the end of that stuff. And so everybody's got different, and also everybody's got different structural stuff. Acquaintance of mine who was at the University of Arkansas said that they had so many athletes in their engineering program that he virtually had, you know, like a third of the team on any given day gone in the afternoon. So they were running most of their good practices, most of their team-oriented practices were all in the morning. You know, I've seen research, and I hasten to say this is really marginal difference, where it suggests that you should do dry land or strength training after all your swimming. There was a difference between doing strength training and then doing swimming. And there was even a difference between doing strength training or swimming and then doing strength training later and then doing swimming again. The best combination was doing weight training and strength training at the end of the day or after your session. Again, the findings were kind of marginal. I mean, you can find all sorts of stuff where it says this is true, but you know, it doesn't make any difference. You know, probably if you ate one of those cookies, and I ate more than one, but if you ate, one of those particular kinds of cookies, you had more or less chance of getting cancer. Probably zero. And you could probably measure it, except it's 1/4 of a chance of actually having any effect on you. So, or being fat or sore, you know. So, my point is that, you know, what I'm saying is there isn't a big difference there. It was measurable, but, you know, so what? You know, I mean, in terms of it being practical. The U.S. spent an enormous amount of time contracting out to get people to build. Have you seen those Fisher space pens? You know, they got the pressurized thing right underwater, you know, right in space. You know, they talk to the Russians says, "Just use pencils." That's the problem, right? And that's a true story. So when you look at these things, a lot of this stuff, and why I think it's got to be kind of conceptual, is because everybody's in an entirely different situation. You know, so if everybody says, well, I do this workout on this day, and I do this workout on that day, and then I do strength training, and then you try to tell like somebody who can't get in the weight room either that day or at that time or within 2 days of that, but they want to add strength training to what they're doing. You know, that doesn't transfer very well. So, you know, again, conceptually, I think it's important to think about it because everybody's going to be in a different situation. And the first thing that I would say about that is, number one, and was privy to an exercise physiology conference on endurance sport. Now, in exercise physiology, endurance sport is anything that lasts more than 75 seconds. So, swimming falls well within that gap. What they said was they thought that the way people design a workout, Tudor Bomba comes to my, because I've got like about 5 copies of each edition of his book. I think he's a very interesting guy. But they would say, all right, we're going to do threshold on Monday, and then we're going to go. John, you go threshold on Monday, you go active rest, then you go his max VO2 day, and then we go threshold. And there's variations on themes here. Then you go active rest, and then Saturday you go max VO2. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Lots of ability right on left. You get that idea. But the point of the conference was that they said, all of these things are ways to conceptualize what you're doing. They're not actually the right way or the wrong way. It's how you in your head are organizing the information. This is how you're thinking about it. So, you could have a completely different cycle. You can do it totally different and have equally good results. And as a result, what you end up with is the person speaking at the conference that had some cycle where they had the fastest swimmer, and so they're telling you what their cycle for their fastest swimmer was. But that doesn't help you if you can't get pool time or you can't get into the weight room, how do you want to do it? So I think the thing you want to think about is, again, from a conceptual standpoint, is there isn't a secret cycle in terms of what the week is. Your cycle is what you're going to make it. But there are 3 things that I think that, that are key to this. And one, and it all involves rest. You get better when you recover. You don't get better when you're training. When you're training, you're breaking the athlete down, and it's when they're recovering that they get better. The classic exercise, I'll come back to this, but the classic exercise for lost the ability to walk. Sugar high, no alcohol involved. But when you look at a classic adaptation thing in exercise science, you start out at some level. They apply a stressor, and then the body gets to a higher performance level. Ideally, you apply another stressor, gets another higher, and the process continues. I think the key things to think about this, though, is there's some line down here that you don't want to go below. So if the person starting here gets down here, they just, it's the Tom Dillon thing. And there's probably, start over again. Wherever you start, there's a line down here that you don't want to go below. And what constitutes that, could be different. And there's probably a line down here where you don't want to be, you want to be recovering by the time you get to that line. So, if you're here, and this is your point, if you're going to go down, you want to come up before you get to this line, because if you stay down too long, you're not going to recover well. You're not going to get that adaptation. And there's a line down here that if you go below it, again, you're not going to get the results that you want. So the idea is, something like this, and then you're off the traces. When you do this kind of stuff, the challenge, I always thought the challenge for coaching college, I think with parents, if they're your allies in this, it's very helpful, but I also thought that with college it was really annoying, because in college, if you start out here, and we'll assume for a minute that the closer you get to this line, the bigger your rebound is going to be. And I think there's some value to validity to that. There's a problem here because there's a certain assumption that there's other stressors aren't happening, right? But if you take them down just to pretty close to that line, and then, oh, I'm not getting any sleep because I'm staying up too late, whether it's alcohol, whether it's just eating poorly because I like pizza every night, or because, whatever, I like lots of cheese, that can drive that athlete below that line. But on the other hand, if you then design it so you're up here somewhere, then maybe you're taking a little bit off what the athlete is capable of achieving if they can get it right. So it's got to be kind of a group effort here in terms of the athletes understanding what's going on, that recovery is the key to all this stuff. I mean, there's tons of studies where, if they start at school at 10 o'clock, kids are about, they won't do it, but that's, so that's the key when you set this up. So going back to what I was starting to say is, research would suggest that any kind of aerobic work, like light aerobic work, any kind, it takes about 24 hours to recover completely. If you're doing some serious threshold work, 36 to 48 hours. And if you're doing real high-level anaerobic work, going, like 1,200 yards of really hard work, it might take up to 72 hours. Now, if you look at how this has been structured, and John did it, okay, he's doing threshold here, and recovery means not hitting that energy system so much again. It doesn't mean like, okay, I gotta do nothing or something. I want to clarify that. But, he's got, 24 hours, he's got, 24, 48, 7. I mean, he's got basically 72 hours between, two major threshold sets. Active rest wasn't stressful, but he's still got obviously a long time between them, and between the 2 max VO2, and he would do different things, but Sunday he'd do, or Saturdays he'd do a lot of 6/100s at 8 minutes. He'd put the towels on the chairs and get bagels and all. Again, 24, 48, 72. So what you want to do when you look at it any given week is think about, if you want to do something, then how much rest do I actually want to put in, or I need to put in.
Can I throw in one observation? Yeah. I've talked to Bruce Ginnell when he was coaching Katie.
Yeah.
And we talked a lot about the difference between the men and the women.
Yes.
When you're doing threshold work.
Right.
Because when you're doing red and blue, men tend to
Don't
have...
do it with women.
Pardon?
Don't do it with women.
Yeah. Men tend to have a bigger anaerobic component because of testosterone, on average. So they're going to be able to swim red and blue without as much of a stress on the system. But we found that with women, when especially more distance-oriented women, they didn't have a lot of anaerobic capability. So they were wearing themselves out trying to go blue. And so all of a sudden, you've got a pretty stressful threshold day for them on Monday. Active rest is going to be a little, then you're coming with VO2 max again.
48 hours later, right.
And then you're going threshold again.
24 hours later.
So the advice that we kind of came to was you either should reduce, and I haven't done it on the charts, I should, is for women, reduce the paces by about 3% for them, so that you protect them more in red and blue, and they can handle the real distance swimmers a little more. How does that sound to you?
No, I agree with that. I mean, I've always done it. I mean, I've not always done it, but I mean, you know, we've always done it with the women, we do a distance swimmers, you know, that stay with
White and pink.
white and pink, yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that funny how you kind of.
Well, you exhaust, I mean, one of the things that happens is that you can, even if you swim extensively, so you're spending for a long period of time, and you're swimming slowly, so you think it's aerobic. But if you go too far, as they fatigue, it has to become an anaerobic. And you can be fooled in thinking that you're doing aerobic work when you're not. And then,
Well, that's why when we did T30s, we split the team in half, and one half of the team counted, and not only counted, but also took splits. So we had on their sheets, each kid had a sheet, lap by lap, what their time was. So we could see their pace per 100 and what happened to it, how homogenized it was over the T30, or you had your kids go out fast and then they would kind of die. Well, if you're not timing, you don't know that. You just get an average time. But is that really an accurate average time?
as we digress.
Yes.
Which is fine. Two things. I got the first couple of things to remind me. But the other thing that we would do when we do that kind of some threshold types of testing to figure out where we want it to be is you can do a heart rate. And what you do is at 0, you take a 10-second count. And at 30 seconds, you take a 10-second count. And at 1 minute, you take a 10-second count.
It's post T30.
Post, yeah, right. As soon as they touch the wall, maybe. And you're going to get different numbers. I hope so. So you touch the wall, they're 30 seconds later, they're 24, a minute later, maybe they're 16. So you get a sum here. If you get a number off of this that's in this 70 to 75 range, it actually validates somewhat the T30. Because what happens here is if they bag it, and they haven't worked that hard at it, but they sprint coming home, they're still going to get 30. But what's going to happen is this one, this will be 30, this will be, 20 maybe, and this will be back to 16 or 15 or something like that. It'll drop off too fast. If they went too hard early, their heart rate has gotten back down to like, when they touch the wall here, even if they're trying, it ends up being like 26 or something like that. And then, because they've been recovering, and then it's 24, and maybe because they're exhausted at 20, and you get, or 18, I just make it more, but, or 16, and it's a little bit, it's a lower, or it could be real, they can go off the charts and just not be bad shape, and be way off the charts, and, be 30, 28, 26, right? But it's not a foolproof way to do it, but if you look at their splits, and we did the same thing, if you look at their splits, you look at the kind of number you're coming up here, you can have some confidence that it's that it's actually a valid thing.
If I just add to what he was talking about with that, you might want to beforehand show your kids how to take their heart rate, because they'll literally sit there for a minute trying to find their heart rate,
Yes.
And whatnot. And if they're like my college knuckleheads, they don't know how to count. So, and one thing that he brought up to me when I was swimming, I was like, my heart rate's really, really high. Like, we finish it, we finish the set. He said, take your heart rate, and and it was you made a comment to me about something like I counted the same beat twice or something because it's moving so fast. And you get, it's like you get a kid comes out and it's like, my heart rate's 38, or something like that. And it's like, well, no, it can't be. But it's just one of those working with them because a lot of times they don't know. They're trying to find it. I'm dead, coach. I don't have a heart rate.
I have one that insists to do it here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's helpful.
Peter, has anybody come up with an earlobe clip sending a heart rate to a watch or anything?
I think they have the monitor.
The polars, yeah.
That's one thing I've seen.
Okay, I just wondered. Anybody know of anything else that's
What are your thoughts of
waterproof?
the pulse ox, like after
You
they
could
get
just
out?
put a pulse ox on it.
Yeah, that works.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Their total number.
Yeah.
I mean, I always wanted to design something that was, where you came in and your heart rate determined the rest, so you could grab it and just hold it.
Well, we had, remember those polar units?
Yeah.
Remember the polar units?
Yeah, I know, but they didn't work a lot.
We used those and, sometimes, yeah.
The new triathlon watches too are actually getting better at that. Not just your normal Apple Watch, but they're expensive, but the triathlon watches are getting better at that.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, Apple Watch.
Apple Watch,
Yeah.
waterproof.
The other thing I was gonna say, I mean, no matter how you do this, there's a flaw, right? I mean, John was saying, like you said, you do the swim camp, anybody with swim camps in Michigan, the first day they did 200, and then they would generate their threshold paces for the week in camp with that 200 pace. There are, and again, the error will be on the anaerobic side of things. It'll be two things. 3,000. And in fact, the Dutch think because men have a higher anaerobic capacity than women, that men ought to be at T40 to make sure it's aerobic. But the problem is, tell somebody to go with 3,000, get excited, be happy. We're going to do this, right? So, almost everything you do, there's some built-in
Before I used to take 10 of them.
So I always felt like it was more valuable to try different things. I mean, try this. Peter Vanderkay might be the only person that every time John did a test, his threshold calculated the same. Every single time he did it. 400, it came out whatever it was. T30 came out whatever it was. But, if you get, go at 3,000 or 2,500 or 2,400, go up, with 200, try that. Also, do something to kind of work backwards. Sit there and, you assume your heart rate's going to be about 180 on red or thereabouts. Give them something, John used to do this too, I know, but, 10 times 300, and you would say like, descend 1 and 2, and then hold, 3 through 10, or something along those lines. But you give them like hold your best average, but it's on like, say, 30 seconds rest. And when they do that, if they do a good job with that, we'll assume that that's somewhere between red or blue, red or blue, if they do it right. Probably, hopefully red, but it might be blue. But you can look at the chart, right? And sit there and look up, 300 times. Let's say they average like, 315 or something. I don't know. Maybe they average 245. But somewhere on that chart, under red column, is going to be that number. Then you got to look across and see what threshold that should generate. So, another way of getting at it, and again, if you kind of have some mix of these things, I think you can kind of get a feel over time of what it should actually be if you're going to do, threshold.
Peter, can I share one other thought?
Yeah, sure.
The 30 doesn't stand for 3,000. It stands for 30 minutes.
Right.
So just remember that for your older swimmers, you ain't gonna have breaststrokers go 3,000. If a breaststroker can hold 120s,
Yeah.
Okay, they're gonna go 2,400. Again, it's about duration. It's not about the distance, it's about the amount of time that they need to be under steady state stress. So calculate how far each of the swimmers should go based on what they should be able to hold for a deep burn.
Yeah, it's not, yeah, and that's the other problem, I mean, it isn't 30 minutes, but then if you sit there and say, well, swim continuously as fast as you can, but we're gonna tell you when 30 minutes is up. Again, not, not gonna get a lot of support there.
I did that.
We've all tried it, yeah. I would also, this is my personal view on it, I haven't talked to Joe about it, I would only do this with freestylers and backstrokers. Would not do it with breaststrokers or butterflies. And I've tried doing weird things with butterfly where it's drill or, like 75 fly or 75 free, 25 fly. It just doesn't work.
We did it the first year.
Yeah, I know,
Fly.
yeah.
Our T30s on fly got the rate.
Marty Moran.
Unfortunately, our 100s and 200s stunk.
But the reason I don't like it with breaststroke personally is because I think it's too easy to swim too far with bad timing. And, even if like their pull is correct, if their kick's correct, it's still, their timing I will guarantee you the timing will be off. And then they just swum for 30 minutes with bad timing. And if that's and that's not going to give you the right pace. So going back to, like just setting up the week, I think what you have to do is look at what your week is and what you have available. And you can do, it doesn't have to be any, there's all sorts of combinations of things. The first time I even heard anything like this was Paul Bergen at a clinic in Dallas, maybe. I think Bob and I were the same one. He was like, we were both like, wait, this means something. But he would set this up, and you can change, the amount of these things. You can move them around. You just have to figure out how to space them out in your week where you're going to do, where you're going to get adequate rest. And meets are stressful, right? So if they've got, a meet on Saturday, this is taken care of. You've got a meet on Friday and Saturday, maybe, like the anaerobic work for the rest of the week is taken care of. I mean, seriously, anaerobic work. There's no real harm in doing any kind of 25s as long as we're recovering. You're not doing 20, 25s on 5 seconds rest, but you're doing 25s on a minute or something. So everybody's going to have a different cycle of these things, depending on what you have available to you. But what you need to be able to do is say, I want to spend so much time. And I was fortunate when I was teaching and coaching high school, because we had somehow fallen into having all of our dual meets on either Friday night or Saturday. So it was much more like kind of a collegiate sort of thing. We had one Tuesday night meet my entire high school coaching career, which was 14 years. And I was like, I'm never doing this again, it's awful. But because of custodial contracts, things like I know that's fairly, Tuesday, Thursdays seem to be kind of, they used to be kind of big day meetings. And again, so that means that you're going to have your anaerobic days here and here, which are a little close together, depending on how much the athletes swim and meet. But, you can't sit there and stick in some real high-intensity workout on one side of that or the other. So, again, what you have to take away from this is, you need to have some aerobic work. You need to have some quality work. You need race-paced work. There's a great running exercise physiologist, and somebody asked him, what do you got to do to be a great runner? And he said, you have to run a lot, some of it fast, and rest occasionally. That was it. That was the extent of it. And this guy's, like PhD speaking, and basically that's what he said. A couple other guidelines. I think that you need to do about 80% of your work at threshold level or less, and only about 20% of your work fast, really fast. So, you know, I mean, it's this 80-20 kind of relationship.
Steven Siler.
Yes. And actually, I can't remember who broke down John's stuff one year, but it actually came out like 81, 20, 19 or something. It came out strangely close. But this is, you know, the stressful, fast anaerobic stuff that you're doing. And this is everything else. And I think where the art lies is figuring in how we're going to do that. Because one of the reasons that you have this combination is because you need some of the aerobic activity to help support the anaerobic activity. If you don't have the aerobic activity, you can't do as much anaerobic work. You will break down because you have, your body does not have the back, you know, it doesn't have the support system basically in place to do it. Now, it doesn't mean every workout has to be like that. But if you think about it in the context, you know, it's not like if you see all these things for eating the perfect meal, you know, every meal doesn't have to be X number of carbohydrates, X number amount of protein. You know, you're talking about like a weekly look at this stuff. And I think what you find is, depending on what group you're talking about, that the difference between the 20 and the 80 gets more and more polarized. I think when you're talking about distance swimmers, you know, some of this is hard, and some of this is going to be hard too, because it's going to be on the high end of the, you know, high middle end of all the threshold. When you're talking about a 50 freestyler, you're talking about, and maybe, you know, 50, 100 freestyler, you're talking about, you know, this being really hard and fast, and this being, okay, this is where I'm going to do my drills, this is where I'm going to do, you know, the easier aerobic work. I mean, a sprinter's got to be the most technically best swimmer on the team. I mean, from a theoretical standpoint, they're going the fastest, drag, squares with speed, and I think energy consumption can cube with speed. So flaws at a high speed are going to generate more resistance than flaws at a slow speed. So you'll see more kind of hacky distance swimmers be successful than you'll ever see a real good sprinter. And as a result of that, you know, they need to do a lot of rehearsal, they need to do a lot of skill work, and that can be part of that 80, a larger part of that 80%. And distance swimmer needs to be technically skilled as well, but they also need to have a different kind of combination to make them be able to be successful at the distances they're racing. There's a, can't remember the runner's name, it's the same, the second guy to break 4 minutes in the mile. And he said, sometimes you have to run a great distance to be there at the laps that count. From a distance standpoint, that's pretty much describes what's going on. So again, conceptually, looking at what you're doing, you know, kind of think about, and you could do this pretty easily because you can look at how much you want to do. What are the, you know, essentially the fun sets in a lot of ways, you know, where people are racing each other, you know, we're going to do 6 100s in 8 minutes on this, and we love to get these sets in. Well, how much swimming is that? If I'm doing 2 sets like that a week, you know, and then I'm doing, you know, I look at some of the other places and, you know, doing blue counts to 20. You know, you start adding that stuff up and say, okay, you know, I kind of want to be in, that's the kind of yardage volume I want to be in for my quality stuff, then I want to build in, you know, that's 20%. We're going to build in 4 times as much of other types of work. And as you go through and look at like how I'm setting, you know, how you're going to set this up, and say I'm going to, you know, I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to spend this time. You're again just putting it into the week, and what I found was helpful because you don't always know what's going on in your athlete's life, is, you know, I would kind of have whatever my plan was for that week for those athletes, and then I would kind of look at blocks like here. And then I would say, all right, I would watch that. And then Wednesday, I would decide what I was going to do for the other 3 days. Because if everything went sideways by Wednesday, or for certain athletes, I mean, I had practices where, you know, either I give the athlete the next day off, or I just give them something, you know, go down, take, you know, turn on the TiVo, you know, go down and, you know, do some technique work, you know, and then everybody would complain. You were getting out of it. I was tired too. But when you set this up, I mean, again, I'm thinking about this kind of conceptually rather than in terms of, you know, like, okay, this is how you should do this. And the last thing I would point out too is your body adapts very specifically to stress. So if you stress it a whole bunch of different ways, it generally gets confused. You know, the response is confusion. So the other thing I would add is kind of, to the extent that you can, is I would try to target no more than 2 energy systems at any given workout. I wouldn't do real high intensity sprinting, then do some threshold, then do some, you know, then do some aerobic work, then go, you know, then go do some other kind of quality work, and I used to work with a guy who used to do that. Like tell him set 10 200s, and they're like, okay, 10 more 200s until they dropped dead. But they didn't die; they were really good in the bottom. But I do think it's valuable because I think if you try to hit too many things in one workout, what you get, you don't get any specific thing targeted well. Your body doesn't adapt that well to multiple stresses when you're doing this. And then also, it really does involve selling your athletes on what they're doing outside of the pool. I mean, there is no substitute. I mean, I've told them before, I said, look, if this is the week, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, better, Friday, Saturday, right? Okay, Sunday. If I see, you know, in college swimming, you get 20 hours a week, right? So we'll pretend everybody does that. But for the sake of this, you know everybody is 20 hours. But assuming it's 20 hours, okay, if at 12 a.m. on Monday morning, you see them until, you know, 20 hours later, which is what, 8 p.m. or something like that? And then you don't see them until the next Monday. Yeah. But all my successes and failures is what you did to me on Monday. Right? No. Look, you're responsible for this. I'm responsible for this. So I think, like I said, the thing about figuring out the rest and recovery is making sure that within reason, and you know, it can't be crazy, but within reason, because they are, you know, your career based on wounds of 17 to 21-year-olds or something. Within reason, you're going to actually, you know, that's where they are getting better. You know, if they're not taking care of themselves after you go through all this stuff, all you've done is broken their system down a little bit, and then they're not getting any better. So they got broken down for no fun at all. So. Or maybe they got broken down because of fun, but either way. So conceptually, I think that's kind of what you want to, you know, what you want to do. And how you do it within a workout probably doesn't make a huge difference. The only thing I would say, again, conceptually about things, is if you want to do something where they're going to have to swim as fast as they can. I mean, I tend at these days to think about, you know, what I'll call front end speed, which is their ability to, you know, to swim the first half of whatever race it is. So, you know, first 50 of 100, first 100 of a 200, that sort of thing. Back end speed. So again, you know, the back half of a race. And, you know, I don't know what the total speed, I don't know, you know, max speed, you know, like how fast can you absolutely go? I mean, you can, this is like fast, you know, like if you're driving at 15 meters or something, you know, this is as fast as you can go. You know, top end speed, I guess it'd be top end speed. I knew there was another E in here. TES. At any rate, so again, conceptually, if I'm going to do that, if I want to do something here or here, it makes sense to do it earlier in the practice because you haven't fatigued them, and so you're probably in a situation where you're going to tap into that in a much more effective way than if you do it at the end of the practice. On the flip side of it, if you want to work at, you know, so if I'm doing dive 50s on a lot of reps, or dive 25s, or 15-meter sprints on a lot of reps for that, work those things, I'm probably doing it at the beginning of practice. If I'm doing, trying to do back end speed, and I'm doing 24 50s where they're like on a minute or something like that, and I'm trying to hold the back half of my race, you know, I'm probably going to try to generally think about doing it at the end of the practice. Now, whether you do a little kicking and pulling or how you want to do that in between, you know, it doesn't matter, I don't think, or it doesn't matter in a way that any of us should care about. But, you know, same thing within the week. If I'm going to work on front end speed and things like this, I want to be fairly rested. So I probably do it earlier in the week and work on the back end speed and things like that later in the week. I know Todd DeSorbo, they do, they actually do a lot of stuff like front end speed on Thursdays, but they basically take Wednesday off. So same idea, different day of the week, but again, back to like everybody's got a different structure, but the same principles apply when you're doing this stuff. The other thing and this is just a butterfly breaststroke thing, I would say is if you're going to do butterfly or breaststroke full stroke swimming, I think it helps them to do it earlier in the practice if you're going to do it like a set. Because both of them are very timing-oriented strokes. And so if you do a bunch of stuff before, or if you do a bunch of kicking and a bunch of pulling, and then you're going, okay, now we're going to do this breaststroke set. Well, if your arms are really tired or the legs are really tired, you're probably going to put an obstacle between them and holding your technique for the full set. And again, easier to diagnose with fly because they just kind of look like the fish that died, you know. But breaststroke, they can actually look semi-sound and be really far off and creating a lot of problems with you. So depending on what you're doing, again, those are kind of, again, conceptually how I would think about stuff. In terms of threshold, I mean, the tendency, and I'm certainly this way, would be to do, like, if I'm going to do a 2,500, 2,000 yard threshold set, I'd probably just do it all at once. But I heard exercise scientists say that he was pretty sure that if you were going to do 3,000 yards of threshold and you did it all at once, or if you did 1,000 yards, something else, 1,000 yards, something else, 1,000 yards, something else, it might make some sort of difference, but he had no idea why and he couldn't test it. So it didn't make any difference, 3,000 straight, or, I mean, not straight, but I mean, 3,000 yard set or 1,000 yard sets, it didn't make any difference to work on. And again, that kind of thing plays into like, what can your athletes handle? If you can get them to go 1,000 yards at threshold, good turns, good technique, whatever, but you tell them to go a 2,000 yard set or a 3,000 yard set, and again, young kids will be less efficient, but and they can't do it well. They just can't stay focused long enough. It's real, you know. Do something, come back, refocus, do it again, come back, refocus, do it again. So, again, not trying to say, there is, more than one way to do this. But again, the idea is to think about all this stuff kind of conceptually. Where do I want to put the sets? How much do I want to do? How much, based on how much time I have. I would personally, like we had to do our strength training in the mornings before we train. And so we tended to do it on the days when we were doing some quality work in the morning. And like quality work, I don't mean pace stuff. What we would do with our strength training is that they would do their strength training, and then they would come back to the pool, and then that's when we would do our power rack stuff, and when we would do, tubing, this kind of thing, which weren't terribly, they were anaerobic, but they weren't, it was really trying to transfer, like from a motor skill standpoint, transfer, what they'd done in the weight room into what they were doing in the pool. And we weren't going very far. They wouldn't warm up because they'd been in the weight room. They'd jump in and swim 50 or something, and then they'd, go to a power rack, go to a session where we're doing, and some of the tubing was assisted, they're just, so we had different kinds of things going on. But tended to do the weight training structured so that they could do it with something like that. We weren't going to do, weight training and then go into a heavily anaerobic set. I didn't want to do weight training going to like a threshold. You could honestly make an effort here, like if you reverse these, for example, there's a little bit of recovery in here because Wednesday was off, as I recall, on this stuff. That they're fairly fresh here in their anaerobic work, and then they're doing threshold, which doesn't require quite the same level of commitment. But if you reverse those, again, they would have been doing this when they were more fatigued and probably aren't going to do as good a job with it. And I think too many athletes think that I'm just going to work hard and close my eyes and it's going to happen. If I'm working hard, it's going to be all right, and it's not. If they're not training at the right pace, it's not going to happen. I've watched, silly example, but from a pacing standpoint, I see athletes that say, well, I want to go 145 in the 200 free. So what I'm going to need to do that is go like 51, 53 and 10s. So they would spend like an enormous amount of racing going out 200s in 51 all season. They go 51. They go 51 in a minute for 101. Right? Because 51 wasn't the right pace. What you're trying to do is establish what the right pace feels like in training. And 51 is not it in mid-season. So the same athlete at the end of the year would do something like this. They go out in like 49.9, and then they come home in 57. Because they practiced doing that all year. They didn't practice going 51, 53. If during the year they're going to go 150 or something, they're supposed to be going, 54, 56, and they know what it feels like. When you get to the end of the year, then when you put a suit on, you get rested, you're ready to go, you shave. Then that feeling like 54, you're actually going to go out 51, and then come back in a real number.
Josh Davis broke the American record doing that 49.7.
Yeah, people have.
Rowdy Gaines made the Olympic team earlier. He went out 5200
Yes.
in a long course, came back in 59.
Yes, they're going to catch me. They're just not going to catch me enough. On the flip side of that, I've seen a lot of people make 99-yard basketball throws. No one's ever built their offense around that. Just inbound the ball and throw it at the other end. We'll do it the whole game. So,
If I could add, with what he does practice-wise, with John, when I swam here, we practice 4 mornings a week too. So Monday, Tuesday,
Yeah,
Thursday,
right.
Friday mornings.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
So
Yeah, most of the mornings, and I actually, this wasn't the cycle I was going with actually the last few years, just so you know. But most of the mornings were either real aerobic, and we had the distance swimmers did more pulling, and the leg-oriented kids, butterflyers, breaststrokers, or just the more leg-oriented kids did more kicking. But they were more aerobic, skill-driven stuff, except for Tuesdays and Thursdays, and that's when we were doing our, tubing and power rack, and some of it was assisted, so you didn't pull somebody fat. And the idea, by the way, with assisted work with tubing was that you needed to train yourself so that when the athlete was actually being pulled, they were still putting pressure on the water. This is a key part of this. Because if they can't put pressure on the water, they're not contracting the muscles fast enough to get anything out of it. So you pull them so fast that they're like body surfing or something, then, that really isn't doing them any good. And, so you want to find some happy medium again. Anybody play tetherball, or if you try to push on a door that's already, revolving door that's moving, you got to push the faster it's going, the faster you've got to be able to contract. So the value in doing something like assisted swimming with tubing, and some of the other power stuff, we had parachutes and we had inner tubes, like 10-inch inner tubes, different types of things. But that we would do, those were the days we would do that. And there was a fair amount of recovery there at the end. Sorry, Linus. But there was a fair amount, so they were doing it right, but it was really a power-oriented thing. It wasn't, like muscle endurance. But that's conceptually how I would think about stuff. And then within a given workout, again, obviously they've got to warm up, they've got to get their core temperature up. But if they were in the weight room, they'd have to do that. But get that ready. You can do things in different orders. There's not a secret to that. But the caveat being, I probably try to do front end speed stuff, this kind of thing early in the week when they're rested, or early in the practice when they're rested. Back end speed, if I'm doing that, I'm probably doing it later in the week or later in the workout. I'm probably doing more polarized stuff as we move down the spectrum. And I will like to add one other thing that's kind of interesting to me anyway. Exercise physiologists went to Australia, did the Australian Olympic team, and they did blood or muscle biopsies. And they're looking for percentages of fast twitch, and there's A and B and so on. They were looking at percentage of fast twitch fibers, slow twitch fibers. And then they would say, can we predict which athlete swam what distance? They couldn't. There was no difference. People with a lot of fast twitch fibers were swimming the mile. People with a lot of slow twitch fibers were swimming the 50. And they weren't exactly sure about the result, but what their assumption was that when you're actually swimming, you can't contract your muscles fast enough for it to make a difference.
Dr. Lockett did a study with the Navy SEALs.
Yeah.
He wanted to see if the guys who made it through BUDS would be more slow twitch oriented or more fast twitch oriented.
No different.
The thinking being, the interesting thing was this, the thinking being that people that had more slow twitch would do better in BUDS because the endurance part was the fast twitch. People that had more fast twitch were more successful. One other thing too I wanted to add about assisted.
But they're doing some combat's fast.
Yeah. On the assisted swimming, what we started doing was we put a bit of a weight on the cord about halfway so that it would stretch out, and then it would stop pulling about halfway down the pool. And then what they had to do was they had to maintain, it was like they were slingshot off the wall, and then they had to maintain the speed that the cord gave instead of pulling them, because that became a free ride for a lot of kids.
Yeah, right. Something else occurred to me as we were talking about this. While I'm remembering that, my Bruce Gemmell story, this kind of goes back to what you were saying before. Bruce Gemmell was speaking, one of the first people of many, the second person actually, But I coached Katie Ledecky speech at ASCA. I think we're on 3 or 4 now. I think Jan Evans has a record at 6 or something. But he was talking about Katie Ledecky and the development of Katie Ledecky. Hold on. It was great, no problem. I mean, and then he's walking out. And he'd been talking about drills earlier in the conversation. Part of the conversation, he was talking about teaching the drills. He said, and be really careful with Katie because some of the drills we teach her, she would like drown because she was so bad at it. It's true, but okay, now, but walking out, the conversation goes like this. He's walking out, I don't remember who he was talking to at the time, but on the other side of him, he goes, you know the funny thing about Katie is that she would work so hard when she couldn't do that she actually got the drills faster than the people that picked them up quicker. And I was like, wait, that's the most important part of this, right? There was an NCAA thing where they were talking about how does a Gonzaga compete with North Carolina. And one of the comments that they made was that Gonzaga had athletes for 4 years. They had pretty gifted athletes, but they weren't quite as gifted as the people in North Carolina. But the North Carolina kids had these great skills, but then they were gone pro the next year. By the time the Gonzaga athletes were seniors, they had the same skills that the North Carolina freshmen and sophomores had. Now they were just as good as the North Carolina freshmen and sophomores. It's not, and with athletes, I think it's important that they understand it's not the speed at which they get a skill. It's that they get the skill. Once they got it, if one of them takes 6 months and one of them takes 6 days, they are exactly the same. They both have that skill. And again, so any of these things, whatever we're talking about, kicking, pulling, stroke technique, all these things, a lot of it has to do with like how much are you willing to put into this to get better. Part of this, the other thing as we're doing some of this stuff, I think underwater kicking is incredibly important. And I'm going to say 2 things about it. The one is I'm going to make a technical. It's underwater. They tend to be different than they are when they're swim butterfly. Okay? And 2 things that I've seen. Russell Mark brought one of these up a number of years ago. Is that if they're doing underwater kicking correctly, if they're dolphin kicking correctly, they will tend to, like if I'm facing you and I'm kicking towards you, it'll tend to kind of push me this way gradually. I do it right. So you're really trying to kick a ball. So athletes coming off the wall on their back, experts, they have a buoyancy, it's trying to bring them to the surface. But the kick is sort of keeping them down. So it's easy for them to kick correctly, kick hard, and maintain their good body position. But if you flip the same athlete over and they push off on their stomach, then the buoyancy brings them up, but the kick also brings them up. And so what they didn't want to come up that fast, so what they would learn to do is kind of like pop their hips in the wrong place, absorb some of the kick with their back, not follow through as much, and they'd go straight. They wouldn't come up, but they wouldn't be nearly as effective. And so they had to learn to kind of monitor where their depth was with their hands and not with their and the other technical thing I would say about underwater kicking is that we do a lot of work on underwater kicking as part of, obviously because it's essential to be really good at this stuff. Kick, you want the wave of the kick, sine wave. You want the wave length to be as long as possible, which means why you start with your chest and your shoulders. You also, they have to get a feel for the amplitude of the kick. And we see a lot of these kids, and even with a butterfly, they're going down the pool on their side or underwater, trying to exaggerate that as a drill to be, to give them a feel for how big the kick really needs to be. But you have to be really careful and go back to like the kicking on the board, kicking on the wall, because the real way they need to do this is they need to kick and press with their chest simultaneously, so their arms are actually above their head. And when they're recovering their feet, their hands can come down a little bit. But they've got to punch their chest every time they kick down. And if they're not doing that, they can't kick nearly as effectively. And what you see them trying to do something like this, where they kick and they pull their hands down, which is what they've kind of learned to do when they're trying to go underwater and do this. And I think it has a place, but I also think they have to learn from a technical standpoint that, and if you see a butterfly, butterfly, they're reaching out, they're pushing their chest as they're, they're punching their chest down and pressing their chest down as they hit, and that's when they're kicking, right? But they don't do it when they're underwater. Suddenly underwater, they're doing this, which is kind of what they were doing with that butterfly build-up as well. But the big thing about underwater kicking, I think there's a part of it where you want to make sure they're doing it correctly, and that can occur as part of anything you're doing during a practice. That's number one. Number two, you also want to be able to make sure they kick at the right tempo correctly. And I think currently, ballpark, if you're using tempo trainers, like 0.45 or something is theoretically about where everybody's at. They might be a little bit faster, a little bit slower, but they're kind of ballpark, so you can put a tempo trainer on. But they've got to learn to do it correctly, because it doesn't help you if they're, if they're kicking 1.0 like this, doing it, like, okay, here I go, boom, I'm doing it right, and all of a sudden it's 0.45, and my watch just said I fell. No. So, anyway, so I think that, and we would do power rack, we would put them on power racks or power towers. Gotta be, the hard part about that is, of course, it kind of pulls them to the surface. Or the same thing with tubing, to help build some strength. But in terms of underwater stuff, the big thing's got to be their technique and tempo. And if they can't do that correctly, they can look like they're kicking them, but they're not doing any good. And then the last but not least, there's no magic set for this. I mean, you can do lots of things in terms of skill work, but bottom line, every great dolphin kicker I've ever known, when they swam the workout, they just kicked that far underwater. They were doing warm up, they were kicking 6 or 8 kicks underwater. If they were doing the threshold set, they were kicking 6 times underwater. Or at least what they were doing was, if they were swimming 100, they always took the same number of kicks underwater. If they were swimming 1,000, they took, it might be a different number of kicks, but they took the same number of kicks. They just did it. And that's a hard sell, but it's true. And my only trick to this, by the way, would be, I used to tell, I still do, I'd have this 2-2-2 turn. And what I would tell them is, when they flipped on freestyle, I needed them to kick twice on their stomach, twice on one side or the other, and then twice on and the breakout stroke is after the 6th kick. So they're going 2-2-2, and then I'm getting them to kick 6 times underwater, and they're still counting 2s. And that actually worked somehow, strangely. But that was the only thing. That was always part of what we did. So whatever you were doing, once we got kind of indoctrinate everybody early, unless you were going to do more, and some of them did. That was kind of the benchmark. You're like, for the freestylers, you're going to kick 6 times underwater. Now, kind of just thoughts on designing workouts. The last thing I would say is that as you go through the season, things are going to change. I mean, the kind of 20% is going to change. When that change occurs, it's kind of going to be up to your system. I mean, if somebody's got 24 weeks a year, it's going to be different than somebody got 16 weeks a year. And how much time you have to do this. I mean, for example, we would talk with the pro athletes, the team elite, and we told them, basically, as you look towards the Olympic trials, you have until 6 weeks out to get better. So we're going to work on getting you better, but 6 weeks out, we're going to fine tune everything. We never actually talked to them about tapering. We said, we're going to fine tune stuff. And I don't know that 6 weeks is a magic number, but I know that 6 weeks in the high school season, you can't sit there and say, okay, we got a 14-week season or something like that. The last 6 weeks, we're just fine tuning. Particularly if, I didn't want to play football or soccer or something, show up 2 weeks into 14 weeks. So at any rate, what I think that conceptualizing, you're going to make some changes. It's going to move more and more towards, like raise pace things as you go. And then one thing I think that is really key when you're getting down to the end is both maintaining the quality and making absolutely sure on the recovery. I would guess Alex Braunfeld swore up and down, Michigan, that anybody could be arrested in 2 weeks. Didn't matter. 2 weeks, you're good to go. That may actually be true if you're not crushed. But I always thought that you see most programs seem to do about 3 weeks, and only because I think it just is kind of like, I don't think anybody who was arrested at 2 weeks, if you do it right, is going to be less arrested at 3 weeks. They're just going to be fine. But somebody who was not quite there at 2 weeks is going to, might be magical, with the extra week, something like that. But I think it's really key that when you're tapering, that you may reduce the amount of stuff that they do. And certainly I would reduce, unless I was a distance swimmer, I would really start reducing any of the threshold stuff. But you would still want them to go as fast as they can. It's not about floating for 2 weeks so I can recover. I think there's absolutely no value. You can get lucky that way. And then, but my experience, I would watch teams do this, where there would be like, Pennsylvania's great for this because their state meets like 2 weeks after the district meet. And so if somebody did that, they would be lights out at the district meet, and at the state meet, they'd be like 4 seconds faster. If they do it the other way, the USA Swimming used to have this series, and I don't know what they called, but they had these international meets that went on after US Nationals. And they went on for like a meet every week or so for about 4 weeks after US Nationals. And there were people coming off US Nationals that swam just as fast or faster for the entire next month. But the key, again, is that they were training to go, think of the international, the ill-fated international swimming. You can swim really fast. You just don't want to crush it. So they've got to be recovering, between, one workout and the next, or certainly within the next day and a half. You want them to be able to recover. If they're, you're not beating them up, you're just making sure that they're absolutely as fast as they can go. And you can have some really great stuff happen in practice between the college conference meet and NCAAs. Because if they're arrested right there, they can do some lights out stuff that's great. In practice, you just have to, if they're having fun with it, you just have to make sure you dial it in a little bit so that they don't kill themselves trying to have fun and go real fast. Save something for the end of the year, for the NCAAs. But as long as they're recovering, given a big recovery cycle, and you're reducing the amount of actual really intense training you're doing, I think they'll swim fast. If they are not doing that, if you're doing too much work, or if you just flatten it out, you can get lucky, but I don't think it works very predictably. I don't know what I have different percentages that people reduce their taper by, but I'm actually not sure how valuable that is. I can tell you, but I'll give it with the caveat that it's different teams. I've seen teams do something like they'll go like 3 weeks. It will be like 66% or 2/3. 50%, 25% or something like that. I know with the women, it's like, I used to do 80, 40, 20 or something like that, though I'm not sure I did it like for 2 weeks, it might have been like 4 days, 5 days or something like that, 5 days for each of those. But I think as you get to know your athletes, you have an idea. And I mean, I've seen programs that have done, they just score it down. Theoretically, there's a guy, name eludes me at the moment, did a bunch of research on tapering.
Mujica?
Yeah, and he was talking about like the most effective taper being, like a exponentially decline, whatever that means. I'm still trying to get to him, but he was big into, you kind of start steep and you come down pretty quickly, and he felt like that was the best way to do it. But and the other last part I'm going to say here back to the 80-20, I know I'm skipping around a little bit, but one of the things about these sprinters is there's a big difference when you see what, I mean, I had a guy, he's Greek, worked with him for a couple of years at Team Elite, and we were doing a set one day, and he got out and he goes, I think you're training me for the 100. And I said, no, 50s. No, this sound feels like 100 work. So, I said, okay, all right, we'll do something different. But all he was doing was swim at a 50. He was really good at it, but all he was doing was swim at a 50 in 28 seconds. Actually, it's 21 miles. But all he was doing is swim at a 50. Okay. So, consequently, if you said, well, how does a guy do those, like the fast, if I'm Greek, how do I get, like the fastest guy in Greece, or the fastest guy, well, the problem with that is, that's what they're doing a 50. If you're a sprinter at the NCAA meet, you swim 50, maybe you swim the 200 medley relay the first day. And the next day you swim the 50 free prelims, 50 free finals, theoretically. Then you've got maybe a relay. Then you got 100 of a stroke, 100 finals, 100 of a free set, 100 finals, 400 free relay. You're swimming 8 times in like 72 hours, as fast as you can. So you have to have a recovery system capable of handling it. And that's where a lot of this, 80% comes in. It also comes in case in training. But it is important to do that kind of work so that that will support the sprint. It's not about, okay, we're just doing speed through endurance or something. It was truly about trying to support their ability to do this stuff really, really well. Because in the end, you want one really fast 100 prelims, you want one really fast 100 at night. There's no contest about who has the best 10-100 at. And the last thing about workouts I will throw in here, the set that I really like doing instead of any kind of threshold set with breaststrokers or flyers was, depending on how I felt, sorry, I think we would go 20 to 24 100s on 2 minutes. And it might depend on the time of year. And I would reduce that, I could stay with this, but reduce the rate of taper, but it's really important to understand how they did this, all right? The first thing you have to understand is basically I wanted 20 or 24 100s. I wanted the same 100 20 times. So, I have a swimmer that I worked with in San Diego, recently, and he did this at long course. And I'm not going to repeat all the times or anything, but we're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it looked like this. He went 14 strokes down, 16 strokes back, this is breaststroke. 14 strokes down, 16 strokes back. He did that the entire set. Didn't change. And 11 through 20, he did 14 down, 16 back. I mean, there might have been a 15, it snuck in there, but there was probably a 13 that stuck in there. But I counted them all, so it wasn't him telling me. And basically, he went between 110.2 and I think 88 was the last one. I'll come back to that in a second. Last one was second 8, but and 109.8 the whole way. Everyone, bing, 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 bing. You know, that's what I'm looking for, and the way I describe it to them is about the first quarter of the set, so the first 5 or 6. You know, I want them, you know, heart rate in the like, you know, 170 to 180 range. It's going to be, you know, they got to go pretty fast to do this. But you want it to be in that range, and you know, the next 7 to 12 here, they can be a little bit higher, but I only want to be high enough so that as they fatigue, they're able to maintain their technique. You know, and then I want them to try to descend the last 3, whatever the last 3 is. So, you know, either 18 through 20, or whatever it would be, 21, 22 to 24. And I think his last one, I think, was 108 something. But the key to this is if they should be able to go about a second faster on the last one, if they do this set right. And it will look something like this, plus they can only go a second faster. They can make it look like this, like let's say short car. So I think they look like this and go a minute on the last one, and that doesn't, not the same thing. They haven't kept their heart rate in the right range when they do that. Right? And if they go too fast early, now it will be obvious that, you know, they're going, you know, 110, 11, 12 or something like that. But even at the end, when they're that pooped, they won't be able to descend, and they won't be able to go, you know, any faster at all. In which case, they swam the set too hard. So it's not about, it's a hard set, but it's not like we're going 24-100 best average, and then you crawl out of the pool at the end of it. I'm sure he was happy to be done, and I think everybody who does this set right's happy to be done, but I don't feel like anybody's going to walk away from it and like, I can't, you know, I'm totally doing what he said. And I think that a good, the reason I like this versus threshold, and you kind of say, is I think it takes care of a lot of the same kinds of energy system needs, and at the same time, it allows them to maintain their technique throughout the entire set, which they obviously can't do butterfly on a long threshold set, at least I don't think they can. And putting fins on them, I don't think helps. And also, in breaststroke, like I said before, you can make it look okay, but it's not. And so it allows a much better chance of them getting in a lot of good work breaststroke. I wouldn't do a ton of breaststroke with somebody if their stroke broke down all the time. Find something else to do and then just put on breaststroke occasionally.
Peter, can I share something I learned from Bailey Weathers on butterfly?
Yeah.
Capacity, aerobic capacity.
Yeah.
His 200 flyers is to kill us. And I coached Bailey when he was 14.
And got on their side.
I was 6. I was a prodigy. Anyway, I asked him, what do you do with your flyers to build aerobic capacity? He said, we do a lot of 25s on a short rest interval. A lot of 25s. And I started thinking about oxygen debt.
Yeah.
So what we started doing was we would swim a 200 or 300 freestyle at white pace, and then we would do a series of 25s and fly. And then we might come back with another 200 at white pace freestyle, and then another group of 25s and fly. He actually did a set that he progressed during the season, building up to 72 25s of fly on the 30 yards, hold stroke counts. Your whole stroke counts stay the same, and you're just cruising.
Yeah.
You're just cruising and holding your stroke. And I didn't start at 72. but he started at a low number. And by the time they got to 72, they're just cruise and fly, holding their stroke, because it's only 25 yards. But you start low and you build into it. And boy, when we started doing that, our 200 flies, that's what we did with Melissa Yeager.
Yeah, we never did a lot of fly sessions. Well, the other thing about that particular thing is that the research would suggest that if you're doing like quality sprinting, I mean, not really heavy, stressful, but 25s like that, and then you're doing aerobic work, that activates more muscle fibers, then the aerobic work becomes more effective when you're doing it. So, doing something fast like that and doing moderate aerobic work is the best way to build aerobic capacity as well. So you're doing two things at once. You're getting twice. The only other thing I was just going to mention, and this has something to do with training, but it also has something to do with racing, is that I was listening to a psychologist talk about the guy, great guy. If you ever look him up, a guy named Samuel Marcor, Italy at the point. Did a lot of research on fatigue as like psychological, the psychobiology of fatigue. It's really interesting guy. But one of the things that you talked about, and you can Google him, he's got a bunch of stuff on the internet, and I highly recommend listening to him, because he talks about, they did funny studies where they gave people a pinprick, and they injected something that made them feel fatigued, but didn't fatigue them. And then put them on bicycles and see how fast they could go. And it was terrible, because it was just because of how they felt, right? But he also talks about the stress on breathing muscles and on your shoulders, making you feel fatigued when you're not getting it. So it's really interesting guy. But one of the things that came out of that was focus. No one can tell me that if someone's going to swim a 140, 200 freestyler, or a 150, 200 free, or a 2-minute 200 free, doesn't matter, or an S-stroke, that it will hurt substantially different than a 139, or 141, or 151, or 149, or 2 minutes, or 201, won't, can't. It's not possible. Particularly with, I'm talking about the same person. I'm not talking about the difference between me and Jim and somebody and Joe. I mean, it just can't possibly happen. But what happens a lot of times with athletes when they're thinking about it is there's an internal focus and an external focus. And the external focus becomes, what am I doing? Focusing on my stroke rate. I mean, one of the things I always really helped with some of the swimmers, and Delaney Duncan, who was the professor in Guilford, was like this. She got a lot better at 200 when she started counting her strokes. Not because it was better, but she was just thinking about counting her strokes. Because the point being is that someone who's externally focused like that is, and focused on process, is actually doing it right. Right? They're putting their hand in the right spot, they're making sure they feel like getting a hold of water, or whatever the stroke it is. They're right spot, they're focused on the turn, they do a good turn. Somewhere in the back of their head, I'm not feeling really good here, but it's a race. They touch the wall, they see the time, and yes, and they go they go with their 139, in her case 205, whatever. But the next thing though is there's another person in that race, and they start swimming, and the first thing is I don't feel quite right. And then for about the middle 100 or 200, the 200, they start thinking, I really don't feel good at all. This is really uncomfortable. No, it can't be more uncomfortable. I mean, the same person there can't be more uncomfortable, but they're thinking about it being uncomfortable. And the two things are happening. One, they're thinking about the wrong thing, it hurts. And then the second thing is they're not thinking about the details. Now, they're a good swimmer, they're on automatic pilot, they're doing a lot of this stuff right, but they're not quite doing it. And then they touch the wall, and they look at the time, and instead of 139, it's 141, little differences. But that's not their goal, and they really hurt, and I died, looking at a terrible time, or the time I didn't want. And really, the whole process was their focus. So going back to when you asked them to do some of these things, getting them to focus on the process as they do it, and getting it to internalize focusing on the process, and then you do it with any set, anytime, anywhere, is I think a real key component of turning them into a really good racer at a level where their best is required. Any questions? Yo, did you
Yeah.
get out of here?
No. I was gonna kind of lead into a final kind of question Q&A type thing. But my question is for taper, when you get down to those like,
I'm watching.
66, 50, 25 or whatnot, is there a yardage, like we don't want to go below?
Yeah, I would say, I would think about it in terms of the meet. You know, if I'm thinking, you know, I'm gonna warm up, 1,500 or something like that, I'm picking a number. And I think, I used to have athletes write their warm up, and then they try them out, and then if it didn't work, we would try something else, and I mean, like the guy who did the breaststroke said, I know what his warm up is, all, I mean, it's in my head, I know exactly what he does. Warm it up, you always want to do the same, but they know what that is, then they're gonna raise, then I know how much you're gonna want to. Okay, so add that up, add it all up, so that number becomes the number. So, because I don't want, if they're gonna be swimming 5,000 yards a day for 3 days at a meet, if I'm swimming 2,000 yards a day for like a week and a half before that, by day 2, I'm not doing so well. Day 3 is, like, oh my God. So I feel like it's important the last day or two to get the last 72 hours. Okay, I'm going to get rested, but I wouldn't go below whatever their meet yardage is till like 2 or 3 days out. Yeah. Then I would, okay, warm up and go home. Spray the sprinters with a hose. Anybody have any questions on that? Ramble for a long time.
Do you think that this is more of a college question, but, it kind of used to be that teams would not really swim great until the end of the year.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's more that people have figured out the recovery, or is it more of a suit trend,
I think people have figured out that you don't have to be like trash lawyer. I mean, I think you can build in the, I don't think that it's necessary to swim slow all year. I mean, one of the things, personally, I understand there's the antipathy that some people have to wearing suits all the time, but I think wearing suits at regular intervals throughout the year is important, because if all you're doing is getting faster at the end of the year because you put on a suit, then you didn't really make them better. You had the whole year and they didn't get better. You just put a suit on. That's not the same thing. So you really want to know that they can get better whether they have the suit on or not. And so I think what's happened is I think people have learned how to modulate their training. They probably, I think over time, like Jeff Kostoff was at Stanford, and I was talking to him a couple years ago, and I know he's no longer there. But he was a big yardage guy. I mean, he was like mega yardage guy. When he was at Stanford, I think they only had 2 real high yardage days. I can't remember what his distance swimmer, he gave me a bunch of the workouts with him. But they only had 2 really high yardage days. Now, but they were more high yardage set. You would have like a 6,000 yard set. But it might be like a 55,000 yard week. When he was swimming, he was probably going 100,000. So probably that other 100, like 50,000 yards was tiring them out more than they needed to be. And when they fixed it at the end, but they weren't getting better out of it, they just stayed tired more. That would be my guess on something like that. So I think they've gotten better at this and swimming faster and still being able to swim. It's not going to be the same because the suit does make you faster, and so it's going to take a chunk out of it. They have to understand that. They can't be, okay, I'm still going to drop 16 seconds, but 8 of it's a suit. Okay, I'm going to drop 8 seconds, but I'm not. But they have to understand that. But I think they've gotten better. I mean, I think you like I said, you watch international swimming, how fast they're going week in, week out. It is a process where You're not breaking down.
Drop 10,
And honestly, I had a friend of mine who swam at Ohio State. She was a great, I think she was a Big Ten champ. And she was about 150, 200 freestyle, back when that was the Big Ten champ. She was a terrible dual meet swimmer, and she swam for a great guy named Jim Montrella. But Jim Montrella was the quintessential distance guy. Okay, Jim Montrella set was this: 875, 825, 1650, 3300, 1650, 825, 1650, 7300, 1650, 825. That would be a Jim Montrella set. Okay, so she would swim like 205 or something all year, right? And then she go 150 or something.
That was his classic.
Yeah.
First day of the meet, 500 freestyle, some girl who kept the crap beat out of her all year long.
Right.
In the first heat,
Yeah, goes from like,
she would drop a bomb.
yeah, 5'10", 446.
And she would swim great, and Ohio State women were like, woo, we're on. You know, and by the time I got there, you know, I'd been in Iowa 3 years, and before Big Tens, I said, now this is gonna happen. They all looked at me, we know.
Yeah.
We've seen it, we know.
Well, the woman, Ruth Hyde, I don't know if she was.
Yeah, Ruth, I remember Ruth.
Anyway, so, but Ruth said the worst part was that, like, she got sick one year. Like, at the end of the year, so I don't know whether she didn't make the Big Ten team, maybe she was on or something. So, and she was fine after that, but the point was, she spent a whole year of her life as a collegiate athlete who's a Big Ten champ, swimming like 201 and 203, and that was her year. And I was like, this is terrible.
Not as bad as Schulberg.
Yeah, right.
I went to a Schulberg practice one Saturday morning.
Cover your ears.
1,000 warm up, okay? All right, line up on the deck. 10,000 for time, ready, go. Okay, so they swim to 10,000, and they get out, and he goes, okay, we got an hour of dry landing. Everybody had a thing to do. Some were on the total gyms.
Yeah, right.
Some were running around the track, and at the end of the hour, they come in, 1,000 warm up, stand above deck, 5,000 per time. That was the Saturday workout. I had some swimmers who came from him, and we got
Years of therapy.
We got them a lot faster. We had some that needed therapy, but some, they got faster because they just didn't. Now, the kids who were like David Morgan and people like that, you know, who could do stuff like that, they would recover and they were fine. But
The rest of their shoulders fell off.
yeah, that too.
Anyway, anybody else? Yeah.
Curious in terms of balance between dry land and swimming, not just in what percentage of work is spent dry land versus swimming, and this is for both of you, but how often would you do dry land? Would you do dry land every day? Would you do it every other day? What's your thoughts?
Okay, I done like every possible way until I got a strength coach where they said, he knows the best and you do what he says. And anyway, we'll go there, the same story. But my two thoughts on it were, we would only do it twice a week. Most of the time we only did it twice a week where it was really seriously heavy duty stuff. You know, like prime mover, you know, like whatever. And we did a lot of burn stuff as well. We worked with Bridge Athletics for a long time there. Just suddenly drew a blank on the guy who was designing the program for us. But a lot of the same kinds of things. So we would only do it. The sprinters usually did it 3 times a week, but most of them only did it 2. But we did actually a fair amount of core work, like for 15 minutes just before practice at the end, like every day. Because one of the things that noticed when I wasn't doing that was that I had sprinters doing some of that all the time, but I had some other swimmers who weren't. And the other swimmers weren't nearly as good as the sprinters were at a lot of the types of things they were doing. And I think it was all about transfer of power. By doing some stuff every day, but it wasn't real extensive. I mean, it was kind of movement planks and things. It wasn't a real heavy duty. It was like 10 minutes. It was almost like a warm up, for practice. But it gave them the core strength they needed to be able to transfer power across your body because so many things are this arm's coming over, this arm's going down. But and if you take took a towel and started trying to push the towel by pushing the edge of it, it just piles up, right? You push a kickboard or something. So I thought that doing something like that help them with their core and with, maintaining it, but it wasn't, we didn't overdo that a lot. But we did two big days where they were in there for like an hour and a half, depending on the swing coach. And we, to be fair, on the last swing coach, they had him with me, and he did a lot of the same kinds of stuff with TRX, and he did a lot of that. Well, they're setting up, which might be a while.
I got it. So this is phase one, and we did dry land 6 days a week. But we did different things, so we weren't,
I've done this, so I've done it.
yeah, we weren't hammering stuff. Now, when Vern came in, the first time he spent a week with me, and we threw everything out that we were doing. I said, I'm gonna commit 100%. I'm not gonna do what we usually do in clinics. You go to a clinic, you hear somebody speak, it's like a smorgasbord. You get a little bit of this, you get a little bit of that. No, we're gonna do this, we're gonna commit 100%, and we'll learn. We'll learn something. And so we adjusted it year after year after year. And I'll send you all this, I'll send you the modules, and you saw the exercises but this is like, we did dumbbell high pull, 5x6, med ball core, 2 sets, squats, 4x20. And then we did a med ball wall series, 2 cycles, beginning of the season. And then this was like week 3. Dumbbell snatches, we did then 2B core trainer, only 1. So we weren't doing enough. It was just enough to get them neurologically and muscularly somewhat into the rhythm, how to do things.
Now, was this before the swim practice or after?
After.
Okay.
After. Some of our, if you do a leg circuit, then you try to go to a workout, swim workout. So I always looked at it, you may have referred to it, I always looked at it, I would rather get the most out of them as I could in the pool. Because that's the most important thing. And then we do the dry land afterwards. Now, there are some of you who don't have very much pool time with your older swimmers. Anybody here training less than 5 workouts a week? No, everybody's pretty good. Workouts at least 2 hours. Okay, so you've got plenty of pool time. If I were coaching a high school team and I was only getting an hour a week, 5 days a week, and that was it, man, I'd be all over this stuff.
You go early to meet to see like.
Yeah. No, I mean, so we did it 6 days a week. We even did it in meets. We went to swim Notre Dame one time, and we were down there, and before we left, the team asked me, can we do dry land between prelims and the morning and finals? And that spoke to how the dry land made them feel. By the time we got to that meeting in the gym, they were fit. They were really fit. And they liked how they felt, and they liked how they looked. And so how many teams are doing dry land between sessions and, Friday night, 2 sessions on Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon. So I just say try it. You won't know, will you, unless you try it and see what happens. And as you go along, you're monitoring, and if you need to back off, or give them a day off from it, give them a day off. But if you start gradually, very, very gradually, and then you just, I'll send you cycle 1, cycle 2. So this is cycle 1. We had 5 cycles. And you'll see all the exercises in here and how many repetitions we did. I even kept track of the number of repetitions we did for the entire season across all exercises. Just I wanted to have a basis of understanding, and how did we swim. We won Big Tens the first year we did this. We weren't supposed to win it. Remember Lindsay Smith?
Yeah.
Lindsay came in as a freshman. She was a 152 freestyler.
Lindsay Thompson, actually.
Yeah, Thompson, our husband, was a bronze medalist in the mile. And
So you did this approach, but you didn't have any that high intensity type dry land for?
we built into that.
Okay, so
Not
through the
first
cycles?
phase, Not
Okay.
the first phase. When you get the leg circuit, and you're going 6 cycles in a row, the intensity will take care of itself. I mean, when you go 5 in a row, it's like, oh my gosh. But they liked how it made them feel at the end of the day. and we went to Big Tens that year, we weren't supposed to be top three. And Lindsey Smith opens up the 800 freestyle relay and swims 145. And she was a 152 freestyle, pretty well trained, swam global green and all that stuff. But right then I knew it was a dry lane. And that's where I think that's where I think women's swimming has improved the most, some dry lane. They're more active. My best swimmers back in the day with the age group swimmers were the dancers, the girls who were dancers. Because their legs were in great shape. And gymnasts too. Gymnasts too. They got too big for gymnastics. Anyway, I'll share all this stuff.
Any other questions?
Yeah, sure.